Welcome to the Architectural History module in Semester 6 for Bachelors of Architecture. The next lecture in the module is on Magnificent Versailles of Louis XIV. In 1624, Louis VIII purchased an area of land near the small village of Versailles, some miles southwest of Paris. This was a modest brick building of a royal hunting box with a great slate roof. The plan followed the standard French pattern of a main central block and was flanked on either side by lower wings and joined at ends by lower arcade towards the courtyard on the Paris side. Louis VIII frequently stayed at Versailles. The village gradually expanded to accommodate visitors, servants, and the increasing ancillary services and industries. But only in the France of 17th and early 18th century could the subsequent developments have taken place. Over the years, the modest hunting box became inflated into history's grandest palace, more than 1/4 of a mile in length, with decorative planted gardens contained by sweeping landscape perspectives of suitably magnificent park. The village expanded into a sizable town dependent on the palace for its livelihood, its three main streets constituting grand urban approaches and complementing naturally formed spaces over the hill. All this was possible because of the absolute power enjoyed by the monarchy during the 72-year reign of Louis IV. Versailles was the palace to be designed for his magnificence, in order to show by its adornment what a great king can do if he spares nothing to satisfy his wishes. The plan of Versailles with its palace, park and town of 1746 is horizontal and vast indeed. From the west front of the palace to the near end of the cruciform plan lake is around 985 yards. From the palace to the central crossing of the lake is 820 yards. And the cross arm of the lakes are 1095 yards across. However, the visitor was not intended to experience the park on foot. The intended time and motion scale were around 10 to 15 miles per hour, the leisurely speed of a horse-drawn carriage. To walk from the palace to the near end of the lake can be tiring and eventually boring. The main plan of the garden was as it still is. The area occupied by it was roughly rectangular, but the impression to the eye was the enormous vista stretching from the facade 3/4 of a mile, beginning at the Grand Canal, which in turn diminished to the horizon, suppressing any desire to explore its remote distances. In the immediate neighborhood of the palace, the home terrace gave laterally so that to the right and left impressive pictures appear, one downward to the famous fountain of Neptune, and the other across the enormous orangery to the lake that was dug by the Swiss guards. To ensure that the effect of distance was not dissipated, Le Notre repeated the device of flanking the central axis with grooves, although here it has been done even vaster scale with even more triumphant effect. Compared with the palace and the park, the plan of the town of Versailles is characteristically neglected the urban histories as a poor third. Yet its combination of approach radials and the glory of the monarch and expediency survivors grid is of paramount importance generally and more so in respect to the plan of as seen in Washington, D.C. The work of laying out the town of Versailles had been proceeding with the palace expansions. The basis of the town plan is gridiron, on which is superimposed three broad avenues which are centered on the king's bedroom in the middle of what remained the original king's block. Between the palace and the town there is a vast expanse, a regular trapezium some 1300 feet across by 600 feet deep. Facing the palace across this space, angles formed by three avenues. The horizontal scale is so vast so as to make the whole composition meaningless, except when seen from the king's bedroom windows. Versailles received its charter in 1671 and had grown to about 30,000 population when Louis XIV died in 1750. It is not known for certain who was responsible for the structure of the town, but it was likely Le Notre was significantly involved at the early stage. The direct connection between the use of the radiating roots motif in the town and much of the detailed layout of the park was Le Notre in design, involved with similar radial axis planning of Champs-Élysées and other areas. The radial roots motif, which can directly be traced back to the plan of Piazza del Popolo in Rome, in combination with the gridiron, also plays a key role in the layout of Washington, D.C. It is highly significant that Pierre L'Enfant, the planner of Washington, spent his childhood days in the park and town of Versailles. Louis XIV, in 1677, decided to move the court and administrative apparatus of the state to a small family chateau some 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. The Pleasance was to be converted into the governing heart of a nation, and its completion that would house the court of 100,000. By 1685, a workforce of 36,000 was busy on the immense new gardens and on additions to the chateau that more than tripled its capacity. To fill the pools and the Grand Canal and keep the many fountains going, Bourbon used troops to divert the waters by means of an aqueduct over the valley. Royal workshops went into high gear to furnish hundreds of rooms. Silk and brocade came from premises of Lyon and Tours, tapestry and carpets and mirrors, porcelains, Europe that had never seen comparison into. The mobilization on a building site since the days of Imperial Rome. The purpose was to create a royal town, but the palace and gardens were to take up most of it. What was there of a town, including the parish church and prefecture, developed into gridded spaces between the avenues of the great trivium which headed toward major western suburbs of Paris. Monumental horseshoe-shaped stables filled the tips of the trivium facing towards the palace. The curved lines were picked up by 3 parapets, rising one above each other over the slope of the approach hill. The topmost parapet screened a large court with lateral blocks that cut into at the back to lead into a smaller court. This court, constricted in its turn, focused on the grand perspective on the principal entrance of the palace. Here was the core of the old chateau built by Louis XIII in 1624, a simple brick and stone structure consisting of a court surrounded by 3 wings. Les Vaux, redoing of 1660s, had preserved the mass, leaving the court as it is, but wrapping the outside in the thick envelope of a new building. The new garden front towards the west was a vast block 25 bays wide, with a deep terrace setback in the middle of the second floor. As Perrault would do to Louvre slightly later, Les Vaux abandoned the steep French roof for an Italian flat roof with balustrade. The setback was filled in by the architect principal campaign after 1677 with the famous Hall of Mirrors. To either side of the central block, running breadthways to the north and south, was added tremendous wings. They were to contain ministerial offices, a theatre, a chapel, and other secondary premises. The entire garden facade, including the intrusive main block that held the royal apartments, now measured 600 meters in length. This unvaried stone screen masked a myriad of functions and multiform volumes that sheltered them, and in front of the facade, as far as the eye could see, stretched the amplified gardens. Former gardens with topiary, clipped hedges and geometric beds were nothing new. The type had gained currency in the context of Renaissance villas in Italy. In the course of the 16th century, an element of fun was instituted in the strict forms. The perfection of total design was relived by hidden delights, surprise changes around corners, divisionary structures, and resting places. Le Notre gardens are open-ended. The perspective does not unfold within a finite frame. With the vanishing point always at the center of the main building, it diverges beyond the limits of the actual garden. The scale is at the level of nature at large. The main building itself takes on merely a focal interest and has sufficiently large or prominent to play even this role in the vastness of its setting. It was the first time at Versailles that the court building assumed the spatial scale and value of the great utilitarian structures of bridges, dikes, and aqueducts. The axis of the garden at Versailles continued the line of Central Avenue of the Trivium towards the city. The section close to the garden front of the palace started from the water pools and ran through the formal flower beds bordered by clipped box hedging. To the south was the orangery reached by a double descending staircase. Then came a stretch called the Royal Avenue, a green carpet cutting a precise path through a ground coloured with fine gravel and crushed brick or slate. Halfway down the axis turned into the Grand Canal. A broad body of water intersected in its centre by a cross arm. Here, Louis XIV kept the gondolas sent to him by Republic of Venice and his private fleet of 2 large gilded 9 shallops, and great galley hung with crimson brocade, at the edge with fleur-de-lis. At the west end of the Grand Canal, 5 radial avenues ran into a hunting park, and beyond this point, yet another burst of straight lines disappeared into the surrounding countryside. The composition of the gardens on either side of the great spine was not symmetrical. However, the overwhelming geometric layout was relieved by carefully controlled variety. Featured elements of parterres or stretches of lawn laced with flower beds and fountains, open-air glades treated as outdoor rooms, grottos, statuary of all kinds. But even here there was nothing without calculated effect, no statue or grove without its thematic justification. The iconography of the state rooms that presented the king as the incarnation of sun god Apollo spilled into the gardens. The famous fountain of Apollo dominated the axis at the head of the Grand Canal. Both within the palace and in the methodical tracings of the gardens, a life of work and play unfolded according to a rigid social code called etiquette, inspired by the formality of the Spanish court. The luxury of furnishings and the magnificent extravagance of costumes, the pageantry and the rehearsed pomp of special galas set new standard of conduct for all European courts. But more than nothing else, it was Le Notre gardens that impressed the royal minds and proliferated. In the age, Le Notre was consulted by sovereigns as Bernini had been before him, and his style was imitated all through 18th century in Spain, Italy and Austria and other German states, but also in Protestant kingdoms of the north and as far as St. Petersburg. Princely residences in Munich, Dresden, and villas near Naples could not exist without Versailles. The lesson, intersecting diagonals and radiant explosions, had been applied contemporarily to the city planning by French themselves. These ideas also took root. They colored the extension or reworkings of major European capitals and entered North America with Georgian Annapolis and Washington. Even after the romantic English garden had offered an appealing alternative to the formalism of Le Notre and the city form had begun to respond to the stresses of the Industrial Revolution, the power of the schemes of the grand scale continued to be felt universally all the way to the near present.
Versailles wasn't built in a day. It all began in 1629, when King Louis XIII had a hunting lodge built, replaced sometime later by a stone and brick chateau. Louis XIV moved his government and court to Versailles. Moved to Versailles, he broke with strict court etiquette and fitted out smaller apartments for more comfort and privacy. At the end of his reign, Louis XV built what the palace was missing, a real opera house. Architect Gabriel modernized the facades closest to the town. In 1789, the French Revolution forced the royal family to leave Versailles for Paris. The future of the palace looked uncertain. The gardens of Versailles, created by André Le Nôtre, are a key component of the royal residence. They surround the chateau on 3 sides. In the 1660s, the east-west axis became the Grande Perspective. The gardens surrounding the palace were made up of parterres enhanced by fountains. They are extended by paths opening onto copses with surprising lawns and water features. King Louis XIV had the Grand Trianon built in the grounds as a summer family residence and a refuge from the hubbub of the court. King Louis XV fitted out the Petit Trianon for Madame de Pompadour, and Louis XVI gave it to his young wife, Marie-Antoinette. The Queen gave orders for the gardens to be replanted in the English style and built a rustic hamlet, a working farm, complete with cottages.
Les jardins sont la grande passion du roi Soleil. Et au château de Versailles, l'eau y a une place que nulle autre merveille ne peut lui disputer. Pourtant ici, la nature n'est pas docile. Construit sur un terrain marécageux, le château de Versailles présente le paradoxe de manquer d'eau. Or, tout au long de son règne, Louis XIV ordonne des jeux d'eau toujours plus nombreux, montrant par là que le pouvoir royal peut forcer la nature. Cette quête de l'eau va devenir une épopée et être à l'origine de la plus importante évolution des techniques hydrauliques depuis l'époque romaine. En 1664, la seule ressource en eau sur place est l'étang de Clagny. Le roi fait édifier une nouvelle tour d'eau surmontée d'un réservoir en plomb. Pour l'alimenter, Denis Joly, premier ingénieur du roi, imagine alors une pompe à piston actionnée par 2 manèges à chevaux. Mais très vite, il faut fournir plus d'eau pour les nouveaux bassins et les nouveaux bosquets. Louis XIV demande alors le concours des plus grands scientifiques d'Europe. Dès lors, ce savoir-faire traditionnel devient un sujet d'étude scientifique. La nouvelle Académie des sciences, créée en 1666, permet des avancées spectaculaires en ce domaine. Parmi ses membres, l'abbé Picard, astronome et physicien, met au point une lunette permettant de réaliser avec une précision jamais encore atteinte les tracés et mesures de hauteur des terrains. Sa découverte est essentielle pour la mise en place du réseau hydraulique reposant entièrement sur un système gravitaire de collecte des eaux en hauteur sur les plateaux environnants, pour les acheminer jusqu'au réservoir de Versailles en contrebas. De gigantesques travaux sont entrepris. Les étangs de Trappes, Bois d'Arcy et Bois-Robert sont créés. Pour franchir la vallée de la Bièvre, on réalise un immense siphon. Mais les canalisations ne résistent pas à la pression. On construit alors l'aqueduc de Buc, qui nécessite à lui seul 3 ans de travaux. En 1681, Louis XIV ordonne un nouveau chantier. Le roi demande à Colbert de faire monter le fleuve. Il s'agit d'acheminer les eaux de la Seine dans les jardins de Versailles. Ce défi va engendrer la création du plus spectaculaire système hydraulique de l'histoire des machines à eau, la grande machine de Marly. 14 grandes roues à aubes, de 12 mètres de diamètre, prolongées par un ensemble complexe de manivelles-bielles, font remonter les eaux à 150 mètres d'altitude sur le plateau de Louvciennes. Le chantier dure 4 ans et mobilise 1800 hommes, mais le débit est bien moindre que celui escompté. C'est alors que naît en 1685 un projet fou. Détourner les eaux de l'Eure en les captant à 100 km de Versailles. La grande difficulté est de franchir la profonde vallée de l'Eure à Maintenon. Le mathématicien Lahire et l'ingénieur Vauban prônent l'usage d'un simple siphon souterrain. Mais le politique louvois crée la polémique et réussit à déclencher la construction d'un ouvrage d'art digne des Romains, plus haut que le pont du Gard. Cette entreprise mobilise jusqu'à 30 000 hommes de troupes. Mais après seulement 3 ans de travaux, Les guerres réquisitionnent les hommes présents sur le chantier et le projet est abandonné. Dans cette quête de l'eau, nul doute que l'intention de Louis XIV dépasse la simple nécessité d'approvisionner ses fontaines. Le roi, mieux que personne, a compris que la magnificence de ces jardins contribue directement au prestige de la monarchie.
With the revolution, the royal railings, a symbol of absolutism, were destroyed. The king left Versailles for good. The collections of paintings were taken to the Louvre, and the furniture was auctioned off and dispersed. But in the end, the palace was preserved. During the First Empire, Napoleon renovated the Grand Trianon for residents during the summer months. Sometime later, Louis XVIII restored the symmetry of the palace by erecting the Pavillon du Four. Louis Philippe transformed the former royal residence into an historical museum. The former prince's apartments were replaced by a large gallery of paintings, the Galerie des Batailles. The fledgling French Republic took possession of Versailles and renovated the Salle du Congrès to accommodate the National Assembly and the Senate. Versailles today is the result of this long history. A former royal palace with prestigious collections, an historical museum, a republican palace. It's also a living place which hosts festivals and shows, dazzling as it did under Louis XIV, visitors from all over the world.
This is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.